Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. This is Alexis joining you, but I'm not alone.
Hi, this is Don.
But I am going to be taking the lead on this episode, and you will see why very shortly.
I'm guessing some of you may already know. Why would Alexis be in the lead? Not because she doesn't deserve to be in the lead, but what topic or subject might cause Alexis to be in the lead?
There's this one specific country, Great Britain, that comes up.
A lot.
Quite frequently.
Yeah, that's okay, because there's a lot of history.
Yeah, only a couple thousand years of it, you know.
Yeah, and a lot of it is relevant to the world.
Yeah, and to us in America.
Yeah, so we'll give Alexis and her Anglophile tendencies a pass on this, but she's going to be driving today. I'm in the passenger seat. I'd like to say that I'm navigating, but I'm probably not even navigating. Just think of me as a special listener who's along for the ride that gets to participate in today's show. So, Lex, what's the episode going to be about today?
We're going to be talking about the Battle of Culloden.
Culloden. How does one spell Culloden?
Culloden, and not to be confused, because you did say this, not to be confused with Flodden, which we've talked about on the show before, and does involve a lot of the same countries and players.
Well, and it seems, at least to me, you know, and again, not that I'm unfamiliar with English/British/UK history, but it seems to me that every time we turn around, there's a James or a Charles. So
yeah.
That to me is the most interesting thing about trying to keep all these straight. Which James, which Charles are we talking about here? So approximately where in time are we going back to today to find the Forklex?
We're going back to the late 18th century, late to mid, 1746.
All right, so 1746. So again, as we often do, the historical what if has to be preceded by the historical what did. So Why don't you give us a little quick historical what did before we take the break, and then we'll come back and explore the historical what if.
Sure. So the Battle of Culloden is between the Scottish Jacobites. So a little history on the Jacobites. The Jacobites are the supporters of James II. If you're familiar with British history at all, James II is actually a Catholic king who is actually ousted in the Glorious Revolution. He has a daughter, Mary, who actually becomes queen in the Protestant Reformation, the Glorious Revolution. After James is ousted because he is Catholic, and the British Parliament decides they don't want a Catholic king. But one of the impetuses and one of the causes for that is James has a son with his wife, also named James. Lots of James, lots of Charleses. We'll try to keep them straight as we go.
The wife's not named James.
No.
This is the James who has a wife who has a son.
Yes, but ironically the wife is named Mary, not to be confused with the daughter Mary. It's confusing. I'm going to try my best to keep it straight. But James, one of the reasons that he is kind of ousted from power is he has a son with his second wife, Mary. And so British Parliament kind of starts to panic a little bit because now he has a male heir to the throne, as opposed to his two daughters who were heirs before that. So that's the build-up to the Glorious Revolution. Mary comes back from Orange, which is actually where she gets with her husband, to take the throne of Britain. But the Jacobites are the people who are actually still in favor of James and his descendants sitting on the throne of England. They think that that is the rightful line to the throne, so they are in favor of putting that line back on the throne. And the Battle of Culloden is the final battle to try and make that happen.
And again, their last name is Stuart. So this is the Stuart line.
Yes.
And the Mary there that you're talking about is the Mary of William and
Mary, yes.
Mary. Okay. See, I'm not... Again, it's not that I'm ignorant of English history. It's just I don't know it as well as Alexis does, and it's easy for me to get turned around as I'm trying to navigate through it. So who would have been, again, helping me, maybe also helping our listeners, who would have been the Stuart kings before? Who was the first Stuart king, and how do we come down to this before they're ousted?
Yeah, so the first Stuart king is actually James the Sixth of Scotland. He comes down, he becomes James the First of England. He is the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who we've talked about before.
And he's the James of the King James Bible thing.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, so the line actually goes James, and then his son Charles. That's the infamous one who gets his head chopped off. Then there's a little gap, the interregnum there. Then we have Charles II, which is Charles the First's son. Now we have James II, which is Charles II's son. So it's James, Charles, Charles, James.
I remember that from world history in high school. I remember actually having to remember like the succession they were remembering. That was the sequence to remember for the test. I remember the James, Charles, Charles, James scenario. So that part's not new to me. And also remembering here, as you mentioned, that the James the First was James the Sixth of Scotland. We've actually talked about that James, I think, in a couple of different episodes for a couple of different reasons. And so there is an affinity or a tie back to Scotland that is connected through that.
Yes.
So the Stuarts have a connection back to Scotland.
Very old connection to Scotland, yes.
And does that play into what we're going to be talking about today?
Yes.
Okay, good. That makes me feel better. If I understand that, hopefully there's a listener out there that goes, I better understand that as well. So in the historical what did, for this Battle of Culloden, what happened?
So in the Battle of Culloden, the Scottish Jacobites, they lose.
Okay. And they lose to whom?
They lose to the British, led by the Duke of Cumberland. He is the general in charge of the army. And the battle is actually over fairly quickly. It takes about an hour. It's a bloody, quick battle.
And I remember reading somewhere in the research here, the little bit of research that I did. So it sounds like I'm not prepared. It's not that I am totally unprepared, but I am also not prepared to lead the episode, which is why Alexis will be doing it. And she is prepared. But the British that we're talking about here are what family sits now on the British throne?
That would be the Hanoverians family. So they have come over. Again, it's that cousin jump. That happens a lot in British history, but it's that cousin jump that had to happen because I mentioned James II is Catholic, and he's a Catholic son. There was the act of succession, and part of the stipulation in the acts of succession is you cannot have a Catholic ruler, they have to be Protestant. So the reason we have the Hanoverians on the throne of England is we had to jump all the way over to this cousin to find the next in the line that wasn't Catholic or wasn't, preceded in death because of somebody else. We had to jump all the way down to get over to Germany to grab them because they were the next cousins that were Protestant and that were blood related.
And so as we were talking actually off podcast, the first one of those monarchs is
George the First.
George the First, will be succeeded by George the Second, then later George the Third. And it's not actually until George the Third that you have one of the House of Hanover who is actually born on English soil and who actually speaks English. As not to say that George the First or George the Second couldn't probably communicate at least to some degree, obviously in English. The irony there being the King of England
is speaking German.
Yeah, and has marginal English at best. But it's not until the third generation of the House of Hanover, the kings that are in the House of Hanover, that you actually have born on English soil, speaking English as native language. That's the George the Third of the time period of the American Revolution.
Right, and I should mention at this point in 1746 where we are for the Battle of Culloden, we are not there yet. We are talking about George II. So right. We're talking about that non-English speaking, doesn't really like England all that much king sitting on the throne in London, which is another reason why the Jacobites kind of feel that they have this impetus to kind of get him out and get the person who they really think should be on the throne.
Okay. And the other thing I think, which is also part of the important background, again, all of this is the what did, so we can more effectively talk about the what if, is that who is also backing this Jacobite Revolution?
There's this other little country called France.
Yeah, so again, we have that scenario where, I know, spoiler alert, England and France are not seeing eye to eye. This seems to happen a lot for, I don't know, centuries.
Yeah, hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah, and so it comes to play here. So in addition to being as we've often talked about, it's a recurring theme. In fact, it's one of the interesting things about having been doing the podcast. I knew how much an importance religion played in European history for a long span of time. The period of the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the Renaissance, these wars having the religious overtones, Catholic and Protestant interests. I mean, I knew that, but I'm constantly reminded that it just doesn't immediately go away. It's something that continues to persist for a number of reasons, even well after the period of time where, in a religious sense, at the highest levels, yes, there's still animosity between the Catholic Church and the various Protestant movements, but it's not open hostility quite like what it was for the most part, but it continues to carry over into politics. That's one of the interesting things I've been reminded of as we've been doing the podcast, is just how much that continues to go on and on and on and on.
Yeah, and even when you are looking at something on the surface, you might not even see it, but then you start researching, you're like, oh, yep, religion is still part of this.
Yeah, and particularly when we center it around, of course, and we do talk a lot about England. We're not apologetic for that, but that was an ongoing theme in English monarchical politics for centuries. This sort of back and forth and back and forth. So, setting the stage again, the battle is the end of an uprising, the Jacobite uprising, and it ends in the Jacobite defeat, which means these pro-Catholic, French-backed, from the House of Stuart forces lose, and they lose to the English throne under the House of Hanover, ties with Germany, Protestant.
Yes.
Is that a decent summary of who the two sides are in this?
Yeah, that's a pretty concise summary.
All right. I've managed to do that, although it's taken 11 minutes or so for us to have done that. So at this point, we're going to take a quick little break. We'll come back, and we'll start picking up now from not the historical what did, but more importantly, as we do here, we are the Alternate History Podcast. We're going to talk about the historical what if there had been a different outcome at the Battle of Culloden.
Would groceries delivered to you in as fast as 1 hour save you a trip to the store? Instacart makes that possible thanks to personal shoppers in your area who hand-select items based on your preferences from the stores you love. And shopping multiple stores is possible on a single order. Instacart picks the freshest produce and even keeps your eggs safe, all while finding everything you usually buy, providing smart suggestions for new items, and even highlighting deals to help you save money. And now you get free delivery on your first order over $35. Let Instacart know we sent you and help support our show by following the link in the show notes. Instacart. Groceries delivered in as fast as 1 hour.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Don here with Alexis actually in the host seat, so I'm about to hand the wheel back over to her. And we're picking back up again, as we talked about during the introduction, about a different outcome for the Battle of Culloden. The Battle of Culloden actually taking place in 1745.
46.
I'm sorry, 46. The uprising began in 1745. The
planning started.
Yeah, the battle is in 1746. And so again, we talked about it's the end of sort of the last hurrah for the Stuarts. It solidifies the House of Hanover on the throne of England. It ends a number of things. So if there had been a different outcome, what's at least one of the first things that you think about, Alexis, being part of that different outcome?
Well, the biggest thing, I think, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before the break, is if the Jacobites are successful, you now have a Catholic line back on the throne of England. Again, one of the reasons they were ousted in the first place is they were very devoutly Catholic. So if they're successful, you automatically are switching religions again, and you're going back to Catholicism. And I think that could go a couple of different ways. You could either try and move the whole country back to Catholicism. The person that immediately is popping in my head for that is Mary I, Bloody Mary. I think that is the less likely of the scenarios because you had Mary I. It didn't go exactly to plan, and obviously the country was not Catholic at that point. I think probably what you would have seen is more toleration for Catholics, more rights for Catholics, I think there were some rules in place where Catholics weren't allowed to hold office and things like that. I think those stipulations would have gone away, and you would have seen maybe a more homogenous existence between Catholics and Protestants. After that, there had been this hard fight to get the Jacobites back on the throne, and the Jacobites had won.
Of course, so what you're suggesting there is we've modernized a little bit now
Yes.
into the early part of the 18th century, and so there's a little bit more room for tolerance and finding a middle ground here. Although the Stuarts were not on the throne, why?
Because they were Catholic.
Because they were Catholic. So again, this is one of the primary underlying elements of what's going on here is the fight over whether England is going to be a Protestant nation or whether England is going to be a Catholic nation. How does that play in though with the connection back to Scotland?
Well, Scotland at this point is Presbyterian, which is a form of Protestantism, a little bit different than England at the time. England is Anglican, Church of England, but they are Protestant at this point. So that's part of the reason James's son James II's son James, and his son Charles actually don't live in England. They're living in France and actually even Italy. They're actually taken in by the Pope at one point. So that's part of the reason they're not in Scotland, is because they're not kind of welcome with the current climate that's going on.
Okay, so even though this is a fight for the restoration of a Catholic monarch, and even though Scotland is heavily involved in the Jacobite uprising, the Jacobite Rebellion, on the side of the restoration attempt for the Stuarts here, it's fair to argue to say that this is not a Catholic Scotland rallying behind a potential Catholic monarch. They must have some other agenda at play, right?
Yeah, they're really rallying behind you're a Scottish king. Let's call him a king. He calls himself a king. He calls himself Charles III, is who we're talking about. So he's a Scottish king that is better than this German pretender that we now having sitting on the throne in London. That's what they're really rallying behind. You do have some little pockets in Scotland that are still Catholic, that are kind of fighting for that return, but it's mainly they're fighting for he's a Scottish person. He will fight for the rights of Scotland. He's not this German outsider that has come over and taken the throne just because he has some bloodline somewhere claim.
Okay, so it's in the case of the Scottish involvement, it's more nationalistic and political than it is religious, because they're obviously not looking. The majority of Scotland is Protestant, a different form of Protestantism than most of the rest of England.
Right.
But it's for them, it's not really a religious fight so much as it is a nationalistic.
It's a patriotic.
It's a patriotic thing.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important backstory, because we're talking about one of the potential what ifs here. So if they are successful, so my question is, let's clearly define what your fork is, Alexis, here.
Okay.
So what is the real timeline is the loss of Charles and his Scottish backing forces. Indirectly, the French who are backing this lose there to, as we already said, to the House of Hanover and the backed Duke who's leading the forces there for Britain.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your fork? What's the alternative? What happens instead?
So my fork is that the Jacobites are successful, and actually it is Charles's father, James, comes over and takes the throne of Britain.
And this is James the...
This would be James the Third.
Okay, right.
Because it's James the Second's son.
Okay. And his son is, the Charles that we're talking about here is Charles the Third. And so James the Third becomes the king of England. And he would be doing so, we're now talking in the time frame of the 1740s.
Mm-hmm.
So if there is a Stuart monarch on the throne of England in, let's say, by 1750, however, let's just say it took a couple of years for that to happen.
Okay.
So by 1750, in your scenario, there's a Stuart monarch. The Stuarts have been restored. That's the way the way they would have portrayed it.
Yes.
They would have removed these usurpers and the others who had come in.
Send them back to Germany.
Yeah, and even the usurpers before that who usurped the throne with with parliamentary assistance
Yep.
during I guess that was actually during the Glorious Revolution. So they've restored Stuart rule, let's say by 1750 to Great Britain. How does that make history over the next 30 to 50 years any different?
Well, one of the things that is coming up very quickly, if we're in the 1750 range, is this thing called the 7 Years' War.
And who are the combatants in the 7 Years' War?
Several combatants, but two of the main ones are Britain and France.
As we were talking about off podcast, there's another name for this war. In fact, my historical thinking about this war, I was first exposed to it this way, and then only later tied it to its global name, the 7 Years' War. In North America, it's known as the French and Indian War because that's how it's named by the British colonies, because they're fighting against the French and their Native American allies, the Indians. And in fact, this is where the war sort of initially kicks off, is that it's conflicts over territory in the New World between an expanding British set of colonies and French colonial interests that are still present in North America at that time, very close to British colonial interests.
Yeah, almost in the opposite way of every other war that happens in this period in time. Things actually start in the New World and balloon and mushroom back over to the Old World.
Yeah, and eventually there, because of other alliances, the various parts of Germany at the time, Prussia and France and England, there's a whole thing that goes on with the continental political and diplomatic intrigue, but it's kicked off actually by what happens in the New World versus it, as you said, being the continental conflict that spills over to the New World. This is sort of the New World conflict that spills back to the continent. So under the scenario where you have James the Third, they're both threes. James the Third would be Charles the Third, his son. See, getting it straight in my head. Under that scenario, they've been assisted to that position by the French. So your thinking is what with respect to the relationship between Great Britain and France under the restored Stuart monarch?
I think if you have a restored Stuart monarch who's been backed by France to get onto the throne, sitting on the throne in 1750, 1751, I think they might be a little bit leery to go to war with France again. And so even if you had these tensions kind of bubbling up in the New World between French colonial interests and British colonial interests, I think there would have been this effort to try and, let's make peace, let's try and figure something out so we don't go to war, because remember, they're one of the only reasons I'm sitting on the throne in the first place.
Right. If nothing else, James the Third may have felt like he owed some of his position to France and would have been more willing maybe to be accommodating towards France.
Maybe there would have been a possibility that territories that we knew as British territories might have gotten ceded to France to kind of keep the peace and kind of try to protract some things from happening. So that's a possibility.
Okay, so it has an impact there, which is sort of the immediate impact, because the 7 Years' War really is fought between 1756 and 1763. But the skirmishes begin in the Americas in 1754 that lead up to that. So we're right on the verge of that. This is not a decade down the road. This is a couple of years down the road. And even if immediately after the Battle of Culloden, where you've changed the outcome to be a Stuart win, it's less than a decade removed from the victory at the Battle of Culloden for the Stuarts.
Right.
So it's really close. So one possibility is there is the avoidance of the 7 Years' War, or the 7 Years' War doesn't play out exactly the same way.
Right.
And so one of the things we were talking about, again, now tying this back to how does this affect American history and not just British history, is, as we've talked about, in fact, in a couple of recent episodes we've even talking about this, the 7 Years' War is an important catalyst leading up to what?
The American Revolution?
Yeah, the American Revolution, exactly.
That little thing
called the American Revolution, because ultimately the issue for most of the British colonies in the Americas, the taxation without representation, that taxation has been imposed to help pay off war debts and to reimburse the Treasury for the costs of defense that were incurred during the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War here. So if you manage to avoid that conflict, you don't have all of the expense associated with that war. And so you might have a scenario where there's no need for these various taxes and levies to be imposed that are among the, it's not the only source, but are among the sources of what actually leads towards the American Revolution.
Right, exactly. Yeah, the British Army, the British Navy are the best in the world. To maintain their status as the best in the world, you need equipment. And especially if you're fighting, you really need the equipment, which is why we have the taxes, which is what leads to the American Revolution.
So again, now this is one of those, it's hard to know exactly how it would have played out, but again, carrying the logic through, no 7 Years' War, no consequence of the 7 Years' War in terms of taxation, no consequence of the taxation, not the same impetus for the American Revolution. So either you totally avoid an American Revolution. I'm of the camp more that probably it was inevitable in some way, shape, form, or fashion for lots of other reasons, but it's probably delayed because you don't have this Catalyst Act. And if you delay the American Revolution, we've talked about this on a number of other different what-ifs. Here recently we did with the episode where we specifically talked about the Olive Branch petition, if it had been received. If you delay the American Revolution for a certain period of time, you can have a real influence or a real change on what actually happens with a lot of stuff moving forward from there. Because the timing of the American Revolution in the approximate time frame right before the French Revolution and other things that start happening, colonial interests around the world changing, this is like a magic window of time here for about a 20, 30, 50-year period of time that if you adjust something inside of that, the ripples can actually get pretty large.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think one of the episodes we'll probably have coming up, this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, sneak preview alert, after the episode that we aired on the Olive Branch petition. One of our listeners and sometimes contributors to the show actually sent me a rather detailed, what about this alternate historical timeline? I think we're actually going to pursue that broader historical timeline. So think of this as maybe a little bit of another version of the prequel show to that, another reason why you might not have the American Revolution among several. We talked about the Olive Branch petition being accepted. Imagine you didn't have the need of getting to the Olive Branch petition. You just extend out the period of time before the revolutionary fervor arises in the American colonies, and that changes things as well. So that's sort of the political play out or potential political military play out. But we were talking off podcast in prepping for this, Lex. You talked about the fact that there's also sort of like a cultural, social element that probably is even maybe not more important, but equally interesting to explore, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the aftermath of the Battle of Culloden, in the real timeline, of course, the British are successful. They beat the Jacobites. So you see this suppression of Scottish culture, of Scottish identity, pretty heavily, actually, in 1746 and later 1746. We're in April, so don't remember exactly what month, but later on that year, there's actually the banning of wearing tartan, of wearing the kilt, unless you are a British officer, which that's a whole other thing we could get into, but so you can't wear a tartan, you can't wear your clan colors, so it suppresses the clan mentality, and several things like that. So, and actually it's not in the song anymore, it was taken out, but actually in the first version, or one of the original versions of the British national anthem, God Save the Queen, there's actually a line that referenced rebellious Scots to crush, and the rebellious Scots is in reference to this rebellion. So yeah, there was this concentrated effort to try and clamp down and kind of smash down Scottish identity following the Battle of Culloden in the real timeline. So if you have the Jacobites winning, the Scottish winning, then you don't have that happening.
Right. And so that, again, just to be clear, because I want to make sure I'm clear on this, or any listeners who might not know it as well, not follow as well, England and Scotland are already united before this happens.
Yeah, that's 1707, so we're away from that now.
That's recent, relatively speaking, but settled history at this point. Mm-hmm. So we're not talking about the Battle of Culloden and the loss of the forces that were backing the Stuart family, the Stuart dynasty, losing their independence.
Right.
Because actually James I, who is James VI of Scotland, all that's happened because of that, they're already unified together. Mm-hmm. But it is, as you talked about, separate from the political change. It's a cultural change that happens, a social change where their unique identity is lost. In fact, the other thing that happens in some of those acts are the rights of certain hereditary Scottish lords, mm-hmm. With their control sort of being more feudalistic in its background in terms of how it worked, their ability to have their own what were called barony courts and to exercise criminal punishment inside of their jurisdictions was basically lost. They lost their unique independence inside of
in the system
that was already in place because of this as well. So it wasn't yet, as you mentioned, a very important thing. These tartan colors, these clan colors, and the various things, you can only wear them if you're fighting loyally for
Britain.
For Britain, even though they represent an identity which is Scottish, because unless they're being expressed in that acceptable window of regimental colors, then they represent something else. They represent sort of this rebellious element that happened that was put down at the Battle of Culloden.
Yeah, I have... Shout out to one of my recent new favorite shows, Outlander. I have a lot of different things running from Outlander in my head because the Battle of Culloden and the Jacobite Rebellion is a big backdrop to that show. And one of the things that's flashing through my head now is there's a character who has a little bitty piece of tartan that he keeps after the battle, and he's kind of hiding it. And it's like, you better make sure no one sees that, because if anybody sees that, even this little bit, it's like 2 inches, but even if anybody sees it, he's going to be in major trouble. So...
Not because he has fabric, but because of what the fabric
means
and represents, right? And so what you're talking about there is that if there had been a different outcome, there's a different level in. It's not unique Scottish nationalism, but it would be a different expression of Scottish nationalism inside of their role or participation in Great Britain.
Yeah, it would have been permitted. It would have been allowed. You would have been allowed to be Scottish if there's a Scottish king sitting on the throne, whereas what really happens in the real timeline, you're suddenly almost not allowed to be Scottish. You have to mold yourself into the acceptable British citizen, and that means stripping yourself of your identity.
Yeah, and podcast is an audio medium, so what you did not see there was Alexis making air quotes around the word acceptable as she was describing it, although you could probably hear it in her voice, is that's the result of what's there. So is it fair to say that an extension of that is since there's a suppression of elements of the Scottish identity, the ideal of being Scottish, does that have long-term repercussions in the real timeline?
I think so, because if you have this, again, the Stuarts come back, they're on the throne of Britain, you have this idea where Scotland is still allowed to retain that identity and still be Scottish. I think you would have had this easier peace between England and Scotland, and they almost would have become more united because they were able to explore their own differences. England was still allowed to retain their Englishness, Scotland was still allowed to retain its Scottishness, while all being British and being united, but I think it almost would have made the country more united because you were allowed to be individualistic.
Right. That makes perfect sense. I mean, it seems counterintuitive.
Yeah.
By allowing more of a different identity to exist, you actually create more of a unified identity.
Yeah.
But, the parallel that I will draw, again, we often draw upon this, it's where we are, so it's who we are, so it's easy for us to talk to, is the parallel, or one of the parallels that I think of about, I'm an American, I'm also a Texan.
Yeah.
And inside of that, being a Texan doesn't necessarily make me any less American.
Yeah.
It's the fact that in the way things are structured, I'm allowed to express my Texanness, and there is such a thing inside of my American identity without losing either identity. They're allowed to complement each other. And that's the analogy that I have in my head. It may not be the best analogy, but it's the analogy that works for me because it is me, and I can understand it. You're saying something more akin to that. Not that there's not a Scottish identity that exists today, but something more akin to it being a different, stronger form of Scottish identity, even which is pretty strong today.
Right.
But even still be stronger and exist, but in that still be more unified to what it means to be British.
Right. And even I'll take your analogy and I'll run with it. Even because you have all the different clans that are allowed to retain their clan identity, we're Houstonians, which is different than if I was from Midland or from Dallas.
You said the D word.
I did say the D word. Hey, it's a big city in Texas. but it's like, yes, I'm an American, yes, I'm a Texan, yes, I'm a Houstonian. And so I think you would even see that between the clans, because the clans were allowed to be individualistic and be their own clans within Scotland, which was allowed to be its own identity within Britain. So again, you're more united because you're allowed to express yourself.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. And so again, now we're talking about the historical what if. You're allowed to be able to do that. That was lost as a result of what actually happened in the real historical what did.
Right.
So the other thing that is interesting to me is this concept of another twist, now going back away from that social element back to the political military element, is that one of the things that was actually proposed or thought about during the 7 Years' War was that France would try to invade and would actually put Charles III on the throne, which actually didn't happen. That was something they chose not to do, and apparently he didn't actually impress the French Secretary of State or other powers that would be. In fact, the interesting thing we were talking about off podcast is he calls himself Charles III, but what is he known as?
Bonnie Prince Charlie.
Bonnie Prince Charlie, and I remember, in fact, this will probably actually be...
Can you hear the derision in my voice?
Yeah. This may actually be the picture that exists on the website for this episode, is a picture of him. You going, yeah, I see Bonnie Prince Charlie when I see that. But he's also known as the Young Pretender, the Young Chevalier.
Yep.
These other things.
He's got several different sobriquets.
Yeah, that are attached to him. But this idea of, if, again, his father had been directly put on the throne, Charles would have still succeeded him.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking that through, is it a different Bonnie Charles, because he's not, sort of this. I mean, when I read his biography, I get he's this almost. It comes across to me as like this philandering kind of, not necessarily altogether kind of monarch, because he wasn't raised in a royal household.
Right.
He wasn't put under the royal responsibility of, you will assume the throne necessarily. Could we have had a different Charles if he had actually been,
given some responsibility,
and would have actually been with his father now as the restored Stuart monarch, being groomed to succeed his father at the appropriate time?
I think so. He's not stupid. I think you're right. He's just kind of this philandering is a good word, kind of in this no man's land. I don't really have a role. I should be the heir apparent, but I'm not because my dad got ousted. So I think if he's given the opportunity, his father sits on the throne, and he's given the opportunity to go and learn from his father, I think you would have seen a different Charles than the Charles that is known to history. The Charles that we know definitely lives up to his nickname. He looks Bonnie. He looks like a buffoon a little bit. Again, I'm gonna mention Outlander. I keep wanting to smack him every time I'm just like, I don't like you. But I think if he was allowed to have some power, to have some influence, to have something to do, I think you would have seen a different prince and eventually a different king.
Okay. So, sort of pulling all things together and summarizing back now, the impacts of a different outcome. The historical what-ifs are, obviously, we talked about the restoration of either Catholicism as the recognized religion for England, which would have had implications, or we have a more tolerance towards Catholicism, maybe not, the pendulum not swinging all the way back now, finding something that's more happy in the middle. We talked about the potential impact on British-French relationships that could have avoided the 7 Years' War, and obviously the thing that flows from that being part of what's there. Are there any other big political changes that you can see that may come from that?
I think we hit on a lot of the big ones. I think there would have probably been some other policy things. We're talking about ousting Hanover, which is in Germany, from the throne, but they're still related. They're still cousins. We got a lot of cousins. So I think you would have seen possibly something playing out there. They're also players in the 7 Years' War at some point, so does it just bubble up in a different way? I think it's not necessarily 100% avoided. It's just that it manifests itself in a different way, and then it plays out in a different way.
Yeah. The other thing that I was thinking about, again, some of the trajectories that we've explored in other what ifs, after George III, that house continues forward, and we get down to a very, very prominent female monarch.
Yep.
In the form of
Victoria.
Victoria. We've talked before about her influence during the Victorian age, how her offspring and her being the
grandmother of Europe.
Yeah, essentially, the matchmaking that she does and all the things there. Again, as we talked about before, a lot of what happens in the late 19th century and even moving into 20th century is a result of some of these connections between the houses of Europe that flow out of the Victorian age. Well, Victoria is descending from...
Yeah, I mean, Victoria is a descendant of the Hanoverians. The current queen, Elizabeth II, is a descendant of the Hanoverians. Right. So, do we possibly have a different monarch sitting on the throne now because we had the Stuarts come back?
Right, and I think definitely so if you continue that line along, because there hasn't been other than the abdication in the early part of the 20th century, there hasn't been really a break. There hasn't been a change in the house.
Right.
That is the ruling house, the monarchy of
changing some names, but that's a whole other podcast we could get into.
But if you particularly in the early part of the 19th century when it was more influential, again Victoria, that through the middle part of the century as well, I think that's an interesting thing to think about in terms of how that would have had an impact on other things. And to me, the very interesting concept is the change potentially on the trajectory of the Americas or the New World. That might have happened there as well. If there is no American Revolution, again, this parity that happens between America and France, both having revolutionary ideas, but for, in some ways, very different reasons.
Yeah.
The American Revolution, yes, it's throwing off a foreign monarch, but it's not throwing off the concept of monarchy for the concept of monarchy's sake. The French Revolution is throwing off the concept of just monarchy in general, separate from there were no doubt there were economic and other social issues that led to that, a much more distinct class system that was the seeds for that. But to the extent of when you start playing with either the French Revolution with the American Revolution, we'll sort of close out on this thought because it's a recurrent theme. We'll come back to it time and time again because you can't avoid it. Those two revolutions influence each other in ways.
Yes.
And so if you remove one, what impact do you have on the other? Now, the American Revolution happens first, and so we normally think of it being, because of the American Revolution, there's more of the impetus towards what becomes the French Revolution. So you may think more of if you remove the American Revolution, the antecedent or one of the antecedents to the French Revolution is different. However, if you have closer French ties, which you've already talked about, back to the British Crown, maybe there's something that the British Crown then influences on the French Crown. Again, the way that plays back and forth, it's tough to know. Is it subtle or is it more pronounced?
Yeah.
But certainly there's an interplay that happens there. So again, for that whole century almost leading up to the American Revolution, any deflection that changes the timing or the nature of the American Revolution
has so many ripples.
It obviously has. It already has so many ripples, obviously on the Americas and on America, what becomes the United States. But it has a lot of ripples and influences back on the continent as well. All right. Anything else before we close it out?
I think that's everything.
All right. Well, once again, we want to thank you for joining us here on A Fork in Time. Hope you've enjoyed this exploration as we talk about a different outcome for the Battle of Culloden. We'll just briefly close out with our typical stuff as we close out the show today. Certainly encourage you to visit our website. That's at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Opportunities there to give feedback, to see our entire back catalog, make suggestions about episodes. Go to the website. It's self-explanatory. No reason for me to talk all about. Just really encourage you to go.
Hey, but we did add something recently to the website.
What did we add to the website, Lex?
Madison's profile.
It's actually, if you haven't gone to the website to see the profiles for Alexis and I, and profiles actually for all of our guest hosts that we've had over time, we have the profile there for now she's been declared the official show mascot.
Yep.
That's Alexis's dog, Madison. So you'll see her profile there now, including her picture. You will occasionally hear her. In fact, earlier during this recording, she was at my feet. Yeah, she was laying in the room. I thought she was going to make herself known. She made herself known with a bark at the very end of one of the episodes that we recorded recently. So I invite you to check that out. Of course, also there you can get links to all of our various social media to be able to share from there. Links to our Patreon page if you're so inclined to support us financially and you're able to do so and have a desire to do. You can link from there and get all the details for doing that. One of the things I would encourage you to do with respect to social media is share us. And you can share on Facebook, share on Twitter. We don't have an Instagram page. We actually probably need to get an Instagram page, get that in place. But certainly all the different ways that you can share social media there. And during this time, we continue to be concerned not only about ourselves but around the world for the pandemic and how it continues to be a struggle. Sharing nice things on social media could also be a good thing these days.
Yes.
So we would encourage you to do that. So once again, signing off for Alexis, this is Don. Just reminding you that we like to sometimes close the show by reminding you of our favorite slogan about what happens if you actually encounter a fork in time. And what is our suggestion, Lex?
Take it.
Take it. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.